It started with a knock. But in Lone Mesa, West Texas, in the autumn of 1879, a knock wasn't just a knock. It was a premonition. It was the sound the world made right before it split open and showed you the hellfire underneath. Inside her small log cabin, perched on the edge of nothingness, Rachel Garrett was trying to forget the silence. Her husband was gone. Her baby was gone. All that was left was the wind, and the wind was a mean, lonely creature that never stopped whispering about ghosts. She just coaxed a flame from the damp wood in her hearth when the sound came. Tap, 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 fast, desperate, not the lazy knock of a neighbor. This was the sound of a man running from his own grave. Rachel went still. The fire crackled, spitting orange sparks into the gloom. The wind howled through the shutters, a perfect chorus for the fear that was now clawing up her throat. Another knock, harder this time. Bam! Bam! A fist now, not knuckles. She grabbed the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The cold steel was heavy, real. It was the only thing in her life that felt real anymore. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast, empty silence of the plains. Then a voice cut through the wind. It was cracked, broken, and full of a pain so raw it scraped against the wood of the door. Please, milk, my son. He is dying. Rachel froze. The words were English, but the accent was not. It was Apache, the people the town whispered about, the ghosts the wind carried stories of. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to let the night swallow whatever was out there. But then she heard another sound, a faint, wretched whimper, the sound of a baby trying to cry but having no strength left to make a sound. It was a sound she knew all too well. It was the sound that haunted her sleep, the last sound her own son, Elijah, had made. Her hands shaking, reached for the bar on the door. This was madness. She knew it, but she couldn't let that sound go unanswered. She slid the heavy wooden bar aside. The door creaked open, and the world ended. There on her porch stood a nightmare from the town's darkest tales. A tall Apache warrior, his shoulders wide enough to block out the dying sun, his black hair tied back with a leather cord. His face was a mask of dirt, sweat, and grim determination. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark pools of desperation, fierce and pleading all at once. In his arms, wrapped in a thin, filthy blanket, was a baby. Its skin was gray, its mouth cracked and dry, its eyes sealed shut. It was a tiny, skeletal thing, so still she thought it might already be dead. But then she saw it, the faintest flutter of its chest, a tiny, shallow breath. A gasp from across the field made her look up. A group of townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Lanterns swayed in their hands, casting long, dancing shadows. Their faces were pale masks of fear and hatred. "It's an Apache," a woman hissed, her voice carrying on the wind. "Rachel, for God's sake, don't let him in." Rachel's gaze snapped back to the infant. She could see its ribs, perfect little ladder rungs beneath the thin blanket. She knew that kind of hunger. She had held it in her own arms. She took a step forward, the rifle forgotten in her hand. "Give him to me," she said, her voice a stranger to her own ears. The warrior hesitated. His grip on the child tightened. He looked from her to the baby, then to the angry mob gathering in the distance. He was trapped. "I have milk," she said, the words tasting like ash in memory. "He will die out here." His eyes, dark and unreadable, searched hers for a long moment. He saw the rifle, the worn dress, the exhaustion etched into her face. But he must have seen something else too. Something that made him trust the impossible. With a slow, solemn movement, he passed the child to her. He was so gentle it shattered her heart all over again. Rachel took the baby, a feather-light burden of bone and skin, and stepped back inside. She sat in the rocking chair by the fire, the one her husband had made, the one she hadn't been able to look at for months. She unbuttoned her dress, her fingers clumsy and numb. She guided the baby's weak, fumbling mouth to her breast. For a second, nothing happened. Then the tiny lips latched on. A shaky breath escaped her. The warmth of the infant's mouth against her skin was a shock, a ghost of a feeling she thought was buried forever. Tears, hot and silent, slipped down her cheeks as the baby began to suckle. A weak, desperate rhythm. The Apache warrior knelt by the open door, a silent sentinel framed against the growing darkness. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing a deep, crusted wound near his collarbone. He watched her, unmoving, as if she were performing some sacred, unbelievable miracle. "You saved him?" he whispered, his voice raw. Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. She just cradled the child closer, rocking gently, the familiar motion a balm on her own raw wounds. The baby's tiny hand, which had been clenched into a fist, slowly uncurled. But as she looked down at the child, a fresh wave of ice washed over her. There on the infant's wrist was a small, crudely tattooed symbol, a jagged black spiral. It was the mark of the ghost dogs, a renegade band of Apache, so violent, so feared, that even other tribes considered them demons. They weren't just raiders. They were killers who left nothing behind but blood and scorched earth. The story said they marked their children at birth, a promise of the savagery to come. Suddenly, the angry shouts of the townsfolk made a terrible kind of sense. This wasn't just an Apache on her porch. This was a monster, and she was feeding his son. The baby nursed, his tiny life flowing back into him from her own body, and every pull at her breast felt like a betrayal. The man at the door wasn't just a desperate father. He was a ghost dog, a killer, and this child was one of them. The warmth she'd felt moments before turned to acid in her stomach. What had she done? She'd locked the door, but she'd let the real danger inside. The warrior hadn't moved. He was still kneeling, his head bowed slightly, the picture of gratitude. But she saw it differently now. It wasn't humility. It was patience, the patience of a predator. The baby finally drifted off, his belly full for the first time in what must have been days. His breathing was deeper, more even. He was alive because of her, and she was terrified. The man looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers across the small room. The firelight cast his face in sharp angles of light and shadow. "They will come for him," he said, his voice low and flat. Rachel's blood ran cold. She thought he meant the townsfolk. She clutched the baby tighter. "They won't get past me," she whispered, trying to sound brave. He shook his head slowly. The movement was full of a weariness that went bone deep. "Not them," he said, his gaze flickering toward the dark windows. "My own people." That didn't make any sense. Why would his own people hunt a dying baby? "The ghost dogs. They believe this child is a curse," he explained, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Born under a blood moon. They say he will bring ruin to us all. Their shaman has ordered him cleansed." Cleansed. The word hung in the air, ugly and final. This man wasn't just a member of the feared ghost dogs. He was running from them. He had defied their laws, their beliefs, to save his son. He slowly unfastened a leather cord from around his neck. From it hung a single feather, broad and streaked with dark tips. A red-tailed hawk feather. He held it out to her. "In my tribe, this means protection for those who give life," he said. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "But for them, for the ghost dogs, it is a mark of defiance, a symbol of betrayal. If they find this here, they will not spare you." The feather was a thank you, but it was also a death sentence. He was asking her to choose, to take this symbol and paint a target on her own back, to declare war on a band of killers for a child she just met. Before she could answer, a sound from outside split the night. Not a knock, not a shout. It was a sharp thwack. Something had hit the door. Hard. Rachel and the warrior, Elon he had told her his name was, both went rigid. He was on his feet in an instant, a shadow moving with silent, lethal grace. He peered through a crack in the shutters. Rachel held her breath, her arms a cage of iron around the sleeping baby. Stuck in the wood of her front door, quivering slightly, was a crudely made arrow. It was fletched not with bird feathers, but with scraps of dark, dried leather. And tied to its shaft with a piece of sinew was a tuft of gray wolf fur. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. "It's Dillard," Rachel breathed, recognizing the mark. Amos Dillard, the owner of the feed store, was the self-appointed protector of Lone Mesa. He fancied himself a wolf, leading his pack of fearful men, Ellen said nothing, but the tension in his shoulders coiled tighter. He moved away from the shutter, his eyes scanning the small cabin as if measuring its weaknesses, calculating the odds. The odds were not good. One warrior, one woman, one baby, against a mob. The shouting started again, closer this time. Rachel Garrett, you've got one chance. Send out the savage and the brat, or we burn you out. Amos Dillard's voice, raw with rage and something else, a kind of triumphant righteousness. Rachel looked at Alon. His face was stone. He was ready to fight, ready to die right here on her floor, for his son. And for what? So Dillard and his cronies could feel brave? Stay here, she whispered, handing the sleeping baby, Nathaniel, to him. She'd named him in her heart the moment he'd begun to nurse, a gift from God. Before Elon could protest, she walked to the door. Her hand was steady now. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but it had been joined by a hot, stubborn anger. This was her home. She pulled the door open and stepped onto the porch. The sight stole her breath. At least a dozen men stood in her yard, a semicircle of hate. They held rifles and torches, their faces ugly in the flickering light. Amos Dillard was at the front, his chest puffed out, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. You've lost your mind, woman, Amos snarled, betraying your own kind for that thing. He's a child, Rachel said, her voice quiet but caring in the sudden lull. And he was hungry. That's an excuse, not a reason, a man named Caleb shouted. They raid, they kill. You forget what they did to the Miller family last spring? I forget nothing, Rachel said, her gaze sweeping over their faces. I remember what it's like to bury a child. Do you, Amos? Or do you just remember how to hate? A murmur went through the crowd. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Amos's face darkened. He took a step forward. This ain't about your grief, Rachel. This is about the law. And I have a document right here. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. Signed and sealed by your own husband, John Garrett, before he lit out. He unfolded it with a flourish. Says right here, this land, this cabin, it's his. And in his absence, management falls to me. It also says, he paused for dramatic effect, a cruel smirk twisting his lips, that if the property is used to harbor fugitives or consort with savages, the deed is forfeit. To me. The world tilted. Her husband. John hadn't just left her. He hadn't just abandoned her in her grief. He had signed her life away. He had handed the keys of her world over to Amos Dillard. This wasn't about fear. It was about greed. This cabin, this small patch of dry West Texas land, was all she had left. And her husband had used it as a bargaining chip, a final, cowardly betrayal. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. The men were watching her, waiting. They expected her to crumble, to cry, to beg. She lifted her chin. This land was my father's before it was my husband's, she said, her voice ringing with a cold fury she didn't know she possessed. And this house is my home. You are not welcome here, Amos. That's not your decision to make anymore, he sneered, waving the paper. Now send out the Apache, and maybe I'll let you stay on as a tenant. From the dark doorway behind her, Elon spoke. His voice was low, calm, but it cut through the night like a razor. She is not alone. He stepped out of the shadows, the baby held securely in one arm. He wasn't armed. He wasn't threatening. He just stood there, a silent mountain of a man, and his presence shifted the very air. The bravado of the mob faltered. It's one thing to threaten a lone woman. It's another to face a man who looks like he was carved from the rock of the earth itself, a man with nothing left to lose. Amos hesitated, his eyes darting between Elan, the baby, and the paper in his hand. His greed was at war with his cowardice. Then a new voice broke the standoff. Amos Dillard, you leave that woman be. Every head turned. Walking slowly up the path, a heavy pot held in her hands, was Miriam Quinn, the preacher's widow, a woman so old and frail it looked like the wind might carry her away. She was the town's conscience, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. She walked right through the line of armed men, as if they were nothing more than cornstalks, their rifles and their rage parting before her. She didn't stop until she reached the porch, where she set the pot down gently at Rachel's feet. "Chicken stew," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "A mother needs her strength." She looked at Amos, and her gaze was pure steel. "This family is under God's protection now, which is more than I can say for a vulture who preys on widows." Amos sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Now see here, Miriam. I see a coward with a fraudulent piece of paper trying to steal a home," she cut him off. "I saw John Garrett sign that paper. He was drunk and scared, and you, Amos, were the one pouring the whiskey and whispering poison in his ear. I'd be happy to testify to that to the federal marshal next time he rides through." The mob was silent. The men looked at Amos, then at Miriam, then at the ground. Their righteous anger had evaporated, leaving behind a grubby, shameful film of greed and lies. Amos knew he was beaten for now. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He turned and stormed off into the darkness, his pack of wolves trailing behind him, their torches and their courage extinguished. Silence descended on the small yard, a silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft gurgle of the baby in Alon's arms. Rachel stared at Miriam, her heart too full for words. The old woman simply patted her arm. "You feed that child," she said softly. "That's what matters." Then she turned and walked back down the path, disappearing into the night as quietly as she had come. Rachel looked at Alon. He looked at her. In the space between them, a universe of unspoken things was exchanged. He hadn't fought with his fists, but he had stood his ground. She hadn't backed down, and a stranger had shown them a kindness that felt like a miracle. Alon handed Nathaniel back to her, his fingers brushing hers, a spark of warmth in the cold night. But as she took the child, her eyes fell on the pot of stew. It was a simple neighborly gift, but Miriam Quinn lived on the other side of town, over 2 miles away. How could she possibly have known what was happening here tonight? How did she know to come? Unless she had been expecting it. The next few days passed in a strange, tense quiet. The town left them alone. No more threats, no more whispers carried on the wind. It was an uneasy truce, a breath held before the next storm. Ellen stayed. He never came inside unless invited, but he was always close. A silent guardian posted at the edge of the clearing. Each morning, he would appear with the dawn, and Rachel would take Nathaniel to feed him. Each afternoon, he would take the boy back, disappearing into the rocky hills where he had made a hidden camp. They were creating a rhythm, a fragile routine in a world that wanted to tear them apart. One morning after she'd fed the baby, Rachel found something sitting on her porch rail. It was a small horse, carved from dark cedar wood, no bigger than her palm. Its legs were bent as if in a full gallop, its mane flowing with an imagined wind. It was exquisite. She turned it over and saw tiny letters carved into its belly. "So he will remember his courage." A gift, a message. He wasn't just protecting them, he was building something with her. A bridge made of silent gestures. That afternoon, she gave him a bowl of the stew Miriam had brought. He accepted it with a quiet nod, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. Later, as she rocked Nathaniel by the fire, she saw him. He was standing just beyond the tree line, a silhouette against the rising moon. He wasn't hiding. He was watching. Not watching her, but watching over her. He was standing guard. A strange feeling bloomed in her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even gratitude. It was something else, a sense of belonging. She wasn't a lone woman in a cabin anymore. She was part of something, a tiny besieged tribe of 2.5. But the unease from the night of the confrontation still pricked at her. Miriam Quinn. How had she known? The next day, Rachel walked into town, Nathaniel wrapped snugly against her chest. She needed supplies, but more than that, she needed answers. She found Miriam tending the small garden behind the old church. "The stew was a blessing, Miriam," Rachel said, getting straight to the point. "But how did you know to bring it?" Miriam didn't look up from her weeding. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said, her voice noncommittal. "And sometimes he gets help from a preacher's widow who happens to be in the right place at the right time." Rachel pressed. Miriam finally straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Rachel, her eyes sharp and intelligent. Amos Dillard is a predictable man. He mistakes loudness for strength. I heard him boasting in the store. It wasn't hard to guess his plans. It sounded plausible. Too plausible. And the federal marshal? Rachel asked. You mentioned him. It was a bold bluff. Miriam's gaze didn't waver. Was it? Before Rachel could ask more, the old woman's eyes flickered to something over Rachel's shoulder. A flicker of recognition? Fear? Rachel turned. Walking down the dusty street was a man Rachel had never seen before. He was a white man, but he was dressed in a mix of buckskins and settler's clothes. He was lean and weathered, with pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Strapped to his back was not a rifle, but a large leather-bound book. He looked like a preacher, but there was a hardness to him that didn't fit. As he passed them, his pale eyes met Miriam's. A look passed between them, a silent, instantaneous communication that Rachel could not decipher. Then his eyes slid to Rachel and to the baby she held. His gaze lingered on Nathaniel for a fraction of a second too long, a flicker of intense, unreadable emotion in their depths. Then he nodded once, a curt, dismissive gesture, and continued on his way. Who was that? Rachel whispered, a chill running down her spine. Just a traveler, Miriam said quickly. Too quickly. She turned back to her garden, her shoulders suddenly tense. A book salesman. Pay him no mind. But Rachel knew she was lying. There was a secret in Lone Mesa, a secret that involved an old widow, a mysterious traveler, and somehow the Apache baby now sleeping against her heart. And she had a terrible feeling that Amos Dillard and the ghost dogs were only the beginning of her problems. As she walked home, the traveler's face was burned into her mind. He wasn't a book salesman. He was a hunter, and he had looked at Nathaniel like he was looking at a bounty. That night, Elon didn't just stand guard at the edge of the woods. He came to the porch, his face grim. A man passed my camp today, he said, his voice low. He did not see me, but I saw him. He carries the scent of the iron horse, the railroad. The railroad. That meant money, government, and men who followed a different kind of law. He was in town, Rachel said, her heart starting to beat faster. Miriam Quinn knows him. Ellen's eyes narrowed. The old woman who brought the stew? She lied to me, Elon. I know she did. There's something else going on here. He was silent for a long moment, listening to the night sounds. The man was not a hunter of animals, he finally said. He was tracking. He studied the ground near my camp. He is looking for something. Or someone. A horrifying thought began to form in Rachel's mind. What if the ghost dogs weren't the only ones hunting Nathaniel? The traveler's intense gaze, Miriam's lie, Elon's warning. They were all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't see. She decided to search her own home for answers. She started with the things her husband had left behind. In the back of a dusty wardrobe, she found his old satchel. Inside, beneath some worn shirts, was a small, locked metal box. She broke it open with the hearth poker. It was filled with letters. Letters from her husband, John, to a name she didn't recognize. A man named Silas. And as she read them, her blood turned to ice. John hadn't just signed away the deed to their home. He had been part of something far more sinister. He and Silas were partners, searching for something. According to the letters, they had made a deal with a faction of the ghost dogs to trade rifles for information. Information about a sacred place, a place the Apache called the Cradle of the Sky, a place rumored to hold a fortune in raw, untouched silver. But the deal went bad. The letters spoke of a betrayal, a massacre. John had run, terrified, leaving Silas to face the consequences. And the last letter was dated just a month ago. Silas, it read, they know. Kyle is coming. He thinks I have the map. I don't. I left it with Rachel. She doesn't know what it is. I told Dillard it was just a deed. God forgive me. The boy is the key. The shaman's grandson. He is the key. Rachel dropped the letter as if it were on fire. Kyle, the name Elon had mentioned. The brutal leader of the ghost dog faction. The boy is the key. Nathaniel. He wasn't just the son of a warrior. He was the grandson of a powerful shaman. He wasn't a curse. He was leverage. He was the map, and the book salesman, Silas. It had to be. He wasn't hunting Nathaniel for a bounty. He was hunting him for a fortune in silver. He thought Rachel had the map, but where was it? John wrote that he left it with her, disguised as something else. She racked her brain. What had he left? Nothing. Only memories of his cowardice. Her eyes scanned the small cabin, seeing it now not as a home, but as a treasure chest with a hidden secret. Her gaze fell on the hearth. On the mantelpiece, a place she hadn't touched since John left, sat a small, ugly carving he'd made for her when they were first married. A misshapen bird. She'd always hated it, but kept it out of a lingering sense of duty. She picked it up. It felt heavier than it should. She shook it. Something rattled inside. With trembling hands, she smashed it against the stone of the hearth. It splintered apart, and inside, rolled into a tight scroll and tied with a leather thong, was a map. A map made of thin, cured deerskin. At that exact moment, the back window of the cabin shattered. Glass exploded inwards. Elon reacted instantly, shoving Rachel and the baby to the floor, covering them with his own body. A man climbed through the broken window, a long knife gleaming in the moonlight. It was Silas. His pale eyes were feral. "The map," he snarled, his voice a low rasp. "Give it to me, lady." But before he could take another step, Elon was on him. It wasn't a fight. It was a whirlwind of motion. Elon moved with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. There was a sickening crack, and Silas crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence, broken only by the baby's frightened cry and the sound of Rachel's own ragged breathing. Elon stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving. He looked at Rachel, his eyes dark with a terrible knowledge. "This is only the beginning," he said. "Kyle will not send one man next time. He will send them all." They tied Silas to a chair. He was still unconscious, a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. The deerskin map lay on the table between them, a silent testament to the chaos that had just erupted in their lives. The cradle of the sky, a fortune in silver, and Nathaniel was the key. "What does it mean?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. "The boy is the key." Elon picked up the map. He traced the strange symbols with his finger. "This is not a map of a place," he said, his voice grim. "It is a map of a bloodline. These symbols, they are names, generations of my wife's family, the family of the shaman." He pointed to the last symbol, a small, intricate starburst. "This is Nathaniel. The map ends with him. The cradle of the sky is not a silver mine. It is a burial site, a sacred place where the leaders of my tribe have been laid to rest for centuries. With them, they bury artifacts, things of great power to our people. To a white man, they might look like silver." So John and Silas hadn't been hunting treasure. They had been planning to rob graves, and they had tried to use Kale's faction of the ghost dogs to do it. "Kale is not of the shaman's bloodline," Elon continued. "He is an outcast who craves power. He believes that if he controls the burial site, he controls the spirit of the tribe. He needs Nathaniel not as a guide, but as a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice on the grave of his ancestors to claim the power for himself." The horror of it settled over Rachel, cold and heavy as a shroud. This wasn't about greed anymore. It was about something far older and more terrifying. Silas began to stir in the chair, groaning. Elon moved to stand over him. "We have to get out of here," Rachel said, her mind racing. "We can run." "Where?" Elon's voice was flat. "Kale's warriors know these hills better than the wind. Silas's men will be looking for him, and Dillard still wants this land. There is nowhere to run." He was right. They were surrounded, trapped in this tiny cabin, with enemies closing in from all sides. Then she remembered the other player in this deadly game. "Miriam Quinn," she said, the name a sudden spark of hope. "She knows something. She lied about Silas. She has to be involved somehow." Elon looked skeptical. "An old woman?" "An old woman who wasn't afraid of a dozen armed men," Rachel countered. "An old woman who knew to mention a federal marshal. She's more than she seems. She's our only chance." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. "I'll go at first light," Rachel decided. "You stay here. Keep watch over Silas and the baby." Elon nodded, his eyes never leaving the bound man in the chair. Be careful, he said. The desert has many eyes. As dawn broke, casting long purple shadows across the plains, Rachel slipped out of the cabin. She moved quickly, staying low, using the sparse cover of mesquite and rock. Every rustle of a leaf, every cry of a distant bird sent a jolt of fear through her. The world had become a hunting ground, and she was the prey. She reached the town as the first rays of sun touched the dusty main street. It was quiet, deceptively peaceful. She went straight to the old church, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She found Miriam sweeping the church steps, as if it were just another ordinary morning. We need to talk, Rachel said, her voice low and urgent. Miriam didn't feign surprise. She simply leaned her broom against the wall and looked at Rachel, her old eyes filled with a weary sadness. I suppose we do, she said. Come inside. She led Rachel not into the main chapel, but down a narrow set of stairs, into a dusty candle-lit cellar beneath the church. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and dry earth. The room was lined with shelves, but they weren't filled with wine or preserves. They were filled with books, maps, and strange, leather-bound ledgers. What is this place? Rachel whispered in awe. A library of sorts, Miriam said. My husband, the preacher, was more than just a man of God. He was a scholar, a historian. He believed in preserving knowledge, especially the knowledge that was being wiped out. She ran a hand along the spine of a book. He spent 20 years documenting the stories, the laws, and the bloodlines of the Apache tribes in this territory. She pulled out a large, heavy ledger and opened it on a small wooden table. The pages were filled with elegant, spidery handwriting and detailed drawings of faces and symbols. I am not just a preacher's widow, Rachel, Miriam said softly. I am a keeper of records, a member of a society that works to protect the native peoples from men who would exploit them, men like Silas and Cale. She knew their names. Of course, she knew. Silas, the book salesman, Rachel said. His name is Silas Kane, Miriam corrected her. He's not a treasure hunter. He's an agent. He works for a railroad baron who wants this land cleared. He's been trying to incite a war between the settlers and the Apache for months, using men like Amos Dillard as his pawns and renegades like Cale as his muscle. A full-blown war would give the railroad reason to bring in the army and drive everyone out, Apache and settler alike. It was bigger than she could have ever imagined, a conspiracy of greed that stretched all the way to the halls of power in the East. And Nathaniel? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Why is he so important? Miriam turned a page in the ledger. There, drawn with incredible detail, was the family tree from the deerskin map. Elon is of the shaman's bloodline, but his wife was the last direct descendant. That makes Nathaniel the heir to the spiritual leadership of his tribe. Not a chief, but something more important, a unifier. He is the one person who could bring the scattered, warring Apache bands together. He is a symbol of peace. But Cale says he is a curse, Rachel said. Cale lies, Miriam said fiercely. He knows what the boy represents, a future he cannot control. If he kills the boy on sacred ground, he shatters that symbol forever. He ensures the tribes will remain broken, and he can pick up the pieces. Silas and the railroad want the same thing, just for different reasons. They both need Nathaniel dead. Rachel felt sick. They weren't just trying to kill a baby. They were trying to kill a future. They were trying to extinguish a hope she was just beginning to understand. The federal marshal, Rachel breathed. Is he real? He is very real, Miriam said with a thin smile. And he is on his way. My husband and I were his eyes and ears in this territory. Since his death, I have continued his work. I sent a message to the marshal the day Elon arrived at your cabin, but he is still 2 days away. 2 days, it was an eternity. Cale and Silas won't wait that long, Rachel said. We have Silas tied up in my cabin right now. Miriam's eyes widened in alarm. You have to let him go. What? No, he's a monster. He's a pawn, but a dangerous one, Miriam insisted. His men will be looking for him. If they find him at your cabin, they will slaughter you all without a second thought. You must release him. It's the only way to buy time. It felt wrong, insane. To let the man who had just tried to kill them simply walk away. "Trust me, Rachel," Miriam urged, her hand gripping Rachel's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Let him go. Tell him you don't have the map. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Lie. Do whatever you have to do. Just get him away from your home. It's the only move you have left." As Rachel stared into the old woman's intense, pleading eyes, she realized she had no choice. She had to trust her. But as she turned to leave, Miriam stopped her. "There is one more thing you must know," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "About your husband." Rachel went still. "John Garrett did not just run away, my dear," Miriam said, her expression full of pity. "He made a deal with Silas to save his own skin. He traded the map for a new life. Silas was supposed to stage his death, make it look like an Apache raid, and give John money to disappear forever." Rachel's mind reeled, trying to process the sheer scale of his betrayal. "But the deal changed," Miriam continued, her voice heavy with dread. "Silas doesn't like loose ends. Your husband, he never made it out of Texas." The seller suddenly felt very cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Amos Dillard wasn't the only one your husband betrayed, Rachel. And Silas Kane isn't a man who forgives." Miriam paused, letting the terrible weight of her words settle. "The man you married is buried in an unmarked grave less than 5 miles from here. Silas killed him the night he left you." Rachel walked back from town in a daze. The sun was high and hot, but she felt nothing but a bone-deep chill. Her husband wasn't a coward who had abandoned her. He was a fool who had made a deal with the devil, and he'd paid the ultimate price. He had tried to sell a ghost map, a sacred history for a fresh start, and Silas had made sure his start was a final one. When she got back to the cabin, the sight of Elaine standing guard on the porch, stoic and strong, sent a wave of relief through her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She told him everything. About Miriam, the conspiracy, the railroad, and the truth about Nathaniel's birthright. She told him about the marshal, and then, her voice barely a whisper, she told him about John. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she was finished, he simply nodded, as if he were absorbing the weight of her grief and betrayal into himself. "The world is full of broken men," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You are not one of them." They turned their attention to Silas, who was now awake and glaring at them with pure hatred. Following Miriam's desperate advice, they untied him. He rubbed his wrists, his pale eyes darting around the cabin, looking for the map. "There is no silver," Rachel said, her voice steady and cold. "The map is a lie, a history of a people, worth nothing to men like you." Silas laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You think I care about silver? This is about land, miles and miles of it. And that brat is the only thing standing in the way of progress." He looked from Rachel to Alon. "You're making a mistake letting me go. Kyle is already on his way. He's not as reasonable as I am." He walked to the door, then paused, turning back to look at Rachel. "Your husband was a squealer. You should know that. He begged for his life at the end. It was pathetic." Elon took a step forward, but Rachel put a hand on his arm, holding him back. She would not let this man have the satisfaction of breaking them. "Get out," she said, her voice like ice. Silas gave them a final, contemptuous smirk and then disappeared into the bright sunlight. They watched him go, a snake slithering back into the grass. The moment he was gone, the fragile piece of the cabin shattered. They were exposed. Silas would go to his men, or he would go to Cale, or both. The clock was ticking, and they had just willingly let their enemy go. "Miriam said this would buy us time," Rachel said, more to convince herself than Alon. "It has bought us nothing," Alon said grimly. "It has only told him that we are here and that we are afraid." He began to move around the small cabin, checking the windows, the door, the loose floorboards. "We cannot stay here. This house is a cage." He was right. The cozy walls that had been her sanctuary now felt like a tomb. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice small. Nathaniel started to fuss in his cradle, sensing the fear in the air. Ellen stopped, looking at the deerskin map still lying on the table. "There is one place," he said slowly, A place they will not expect us to go. A place Kale will not dare defile until the moon is right for his ritual. He pointed to a spot on the map, high in the jagged peaks that bordered their valley. We go to the cradle of the sky. It was a crazy, desperate plan to run toward the very place their enemies were focused on, to hide in the heart of the serpent's lair. They'll be looking for us on the trails in the woods, Elon reasoned. They will not look for us on holy ground. Not yet. It gives us a day, maybe more. Enough time for your marshal to arrive? Rachel scooped Nathaniel from his cradle, holding him tight. His warmth was a small anchor in a sea of terror. She looked at Alon, at the grim resolve in his face. She had trusted him with her life, with this child's life. She would trust him now. What do we need? She asked, her voice firm again. Water, food, the blankets from the cradle, he commanded, already gathering a small water skin and a pouch of dried meat. And this. He picked up her rifle. Travel light, move fast, we leave now. They slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the landscape like ghosts. The home she had fought for, bled for, was now abandoned. Just a tiny wooden box filled with dangerous secrets waiting for the wolves to descend. They moved through the brutal, sun-baked landscape. Elon led the way, his steps silent and sure, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the terrain like a language she didn't know. Rachel followed, Nathaniel strapped to her chest in a makeshift sling. The baby was quiet, his dark eyes wide, watching the world go by. The climb into the high country was grueling. The air grew thin and cold. The easy trails gave way to treacherous scree slopes and narrow ledges with sheer drops. More than once, Rachel's foot slipped, and Alon's hand would shoot out, steadying her, his grip like iron. They were a team, moving with a shared purpose, a shared desperation. As dusk began to fall, they reached a high plateau, a hidden pocket of green nestled among the stark gray peaks. A small spring bubbled up from the rocks, feeding a patch of impossibly lush grass. Ancient, twisted junipers clung to the cliffsides. It was beautiful and utterly silent. We rest here, Elon said, his voice a low whisper. In the center of the plateau stood a circle of tall, slender stones, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. They looked like sentinels guarding a sacred space. This was it, the cradle of the sky. It wasn't a cave or a tomb, but an open-air sanctuary. The air here felt different, thinner, purer, holier. Rachel felt like an intruder, a trespasser on ground that did not belong to her. They made a small, smokeless fire in the lee of a rock outcropping. Elon shared his dried meat, and they drank from the spring. Nathaniel, exhausted from the journey, slept soundly against Rachel's chest. As darkness fell, a blanket of stars so thick and bright it looked like spilled diamonds was cast across the sky. The silence was absolute. My wife wanted to bring him here for his naming ceremony, Elon said softly, his voice full of a grief he rarely showed. She wanted him to be blessed by the ancestors. He looked over at the sleeping child. Now he is hunted in the land that should have been his birthright. Rachel reached out, her hand covering his. He has you. That is his birthright. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. His skin was calloused and rough, but his touch was gentle. They sat like that for a long time, two solitary figures in a vast, sacred wilderness, finding solace in a simple human connection. But their peace was short-lived. A flicker of light from the valley below caught Ellen's eye. He was on his feet in an instant, moving to the edge of the plateau, peering down into the darkness. Rachel followed, her heart in her throat. Far below, she could see it. A single torch, then another, and another. A line of them, moving like a fiery serpent through the plains. And they were all heading in one direction, toward her cabin. Silas, she breathed. He brought his men. They watched, helpless, as the ring of torches tightened around the small dark square that was her home. There was a pause, then a bloom of orange light. It grew brighter, angrier, licking up into the night sky. They were burning it to the ground, everything. The rocking chair, the cradle, the names carved into the beam, her home, her past. All of it was turning to ash and smoke under the silent watching stars. A wave of despair so profound washed over her that she felt her legs might give way. But then she saw another set of lights, approaching from the east, not torches. These were dimmer, moving in a scattered, chaotic pattern. Kyle, Elon whispered, his voice tight with hatred. He has come. The two groups of hunters, Silas's men and Kale's ghost dogs, were converging on the smoldering ruin of her life. They hadn't found their prey, and now the hunt would truly begin. The valley below was no longer a home, it was a war zone, and they were trapped above it on a sacred mountain that was about to become a battlefield. The fire below was a funeral pyre. Rachel watched the last of her old life burn away, the smoke a dark smudge against the stars. The despair was a physical thing, a cold weight in her chest. But as she looked at Alon's stoic profile and felt the warm, trusting weight of Nathaniel sleeping against her, the despair began to burn away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They had taken her home. They would not take her future. They will search the valley first, Elon said, his voice a low rumble. When they find nothing, they will come up. Both of them. Kyle will want his sacrifice. Silas will want his prize. They will fight each other, Rachel realized. 2 packs of wolves, 1 prize. It will not matter who wins, Elon said grimly. The victor will still come for us. We have until dawn, maybe less. One day. The marshal was still 1 day away. They had to survive until then, alone, on this mountain. Is there another way down? She asked. He shook his head. This is the only path a woman with a child could take. The other ways, they are for spirits and eagles. So they were trapped. Their only advantage was the high ground and the sanctity of this place. But that wouldn't hold for long against men who respected nothing. Then we don't run, Rachel said, the words surprising her with their firmness. We make our stand here. Elon looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He saw not a frightened widow, but a woman who had been forged into something new by fire and loss. This is holy ground, he said, a warning in his voice. There has not been blood spilled here for 1,000 years. Then let's pray it's not ours, she replied. They spent the next few hours preparing. It was a pitiful defense. Elon, using his knife, dug a shallow trench behind the circle of stones, a place for Rachel and Nathaniel to take cover. He showed her how to load and reload the rifle until she could do it in the dark by feel alone. He gathered a small pile of loose rocks, the size of a man's fist, near the edge of the plateau overlooking the trail. As he worked, a change came over him. The quiet, grieving father receded and the warrior emerged. Every movement was precise, economical, and deadly. He was a man preparing for his final battle. Rachel watched him, her heart aching. He was willing to die here to give her and his son a few more hours of life. Elon, she said softly as he sharpened the edge of a flat rock into a crude hand axe. He paused, looking at her in the starlight. My son, Elijah. He had red hair, she said, the words spilling out of her. Just a wisp of it. He was so small. When the fever took him, I held him for hours, trying to give him my warmth. But he just got colder. She had never told anyone that, not even her husband. Elon said nothing, but he stopped his work and listened. I thought my heart had been carved out, she continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. I thought I could never feel anything again. But this child, she looked down at Nathaniel. He and you made me feel again. Even if it's just fear, it's better than the emptiness. Thank you for that. He walked over to her and knelt down, his eyes level with hers. He reached out and gently touched a tear that was tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. My wife's name was Tashina, he said, his voice rough with emotion. It means dove. She was the sun. When she died, the world went dark. But you, he looked at her, his gaze intense. You have brought the dawn back into my son's life. I will not let the darkness take him again. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound intimacy, of shared fate. We will face the dawn together, he whispered. Just before the first hint of gray light touched the eastern horizon, they heard it, the sound of pebbles skittering down the path. They were coming. Elon put Rachel and the baby in the shallow trench behind the stones. Do not move no matter what you hear, he commanded. He handed her the rifle. If I fall, Do not let them take the boy alive. The finality of his words was like a punch to the gut. She nodded, unable to speak. He took his position behind a large boulder at the head of the trail, his makeshift axe in one hand, his knife in the other. A lone warrior preparing to hold back the tide. The first man to appear over the ledge was one of Silas's men, a rough-looking man with a pistol in his hand. He never saw Elin. A shadow detached itself from the rocks. There was a swift, brutal movement, and the man crumpled without a sound. Elin dragged his body out of sight. Two more came. Elin dispatched them with the same terrifying silence and efficiency. He was not just a warrior, he was a ghost, an avenging spirit protecting his sacred ground. But then Silas himself appeared, flanked by four more men. They were moving cautiously now, fanning out, their rifles ready. They had found their fallen comrades. "He's here!" Silas shouted. "Spread out! Find the woman and the kid!" Gunfire erupted. Bullets sparked off the rocks around Alon's position. He was pinned down. From her hiding place, Rachel could hear the men crashing through the brush, getting closer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Nathaniel, sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the death that was circling them. She remembered Elon's words. Do not let them take him alive. One of Silas's men was circling around the stones, trying to flank Elon. He was going to stumble right into her. In seconds, he would be upon them. Rachel's mind raced. The rifle was too loud. It would give away their position instantly. She looked around desperately. Her eyes landed on the small pile of rocks Elon had gathered. The man was getting closer. She could hear his heavy, wheezing breaths. With a surge of adrenaline, she laid Nathaniel gently in the trench, grabbed the heaviest rock she could hold, and scrambled to her feet. The man rounded the standing stone, his back to her. He was looking toward the firefight, his rifle raised. Rachel didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She acted. She brought the rock down on the back of his head with all the strength she possessed. He grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and dropped to his knees, then fell face first into the dirt. She stood over him, panting, the heavy rock still in her hand. She had just attacked a man, maybe killed him, and she felt no remorse, only a fierce protective fire. But her victory was short-lived. Across the plateau, Silas saw her. "There!" he screamed, pointing. "The woman!" He raised his rifle, taking aim directly at her. Time seemed to slow down. She was exposed, helpless. She could see the dark hole of the barrel, the cold focus in Silas's eyes. This was it. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Silas's rifle. It was from hers. A figure rose up from behind the rocks where Alon had been pinned down. But it wasn't Alon. It was Miriam Quinn. She held Rachel's rifle, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. Silas staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of shock and pain. His rifle clattered to the ground. Miriam was not alone. Behind her, rising up from the rocks and trails, were a dozen Apache warriors. Not ghost dogs. These were older men, their faces grim and determined, armed with bows and old rifles. They moved with a quiet authority, surrounding Silas's remaining men, who dropped their weapons in stunned confusion. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Rachel stared, dumbfounded. Where had they come from? Then Alon appeared from the shadows, his knife still in his hand. He went to the old warrior at the front of the Apache group and clasped his arm. "Thank you, my uncle," Elan said in the Apache tongue. The old man nodded. "The spirits of this mountain called to us. They would not let the shaman's bloodline end in fire." Miriam walked over to Rachel, her face flushed with exertion. She handed the rifle back. "I told you the marshal was on his way," she said, a small triumphant smile on her lips. "I just didn't say which way he was coming from." She nodded toward the valley, and Rachel saw them. A column of blue-coated soldiers on horseback, riding fast. The real U.S. Marshals. But as relief washed over her, a new sound cut through the air. A high, keening cry from the trail below. A war cry, Kyle. The ghost dogs had finally arrived. But they weren't met by a lone warrior. They were met by a line of resolute Apache elders, United States Marshals, and a preacher's widow with a surprisingly steady aim. The battle for the cradle of the sky was over. But the fight for Nathaniel's future had just begun. A full year passed. The seasons turned over the red hills of Lone Mesa, and the scars on the land began to heal. The ashes of Rachel's cabin were cleared away, and in its place something new began to grow. Not a house, but a community. With the backing of the federal marshal and the protection of Elan's reunited tribe, the land was declared a protected territory, a sanctuary for those who had been displaced. Silas Kane and his surviving men were in federal prison, their railroad conspiracy exposed and dismantled by Miriam's meticulous records. Kyle and the last of the ghost dogs had vanished back into the wilderness, a fading nightmare. And Amos Dillard, stripped of his power and his stolen land, left Lone Mesa in shame. Rachel didn't rebuild her cabin in the same spot. Instead, she and Elin, with help from both settlers and Apache, built a new structure near the spring. It was larger, with thick adobe walls and a wide, welcoming porch. It wasn't just a home, it was a school. Every morning, half a dozen children, the sons and daughters of settlers and the children of Elan's people, sat on benches that Elan had built. Rachel taught them. She taught them their letters in English, and an Apache elder taught them the stories of the tribe. They learned that different words could mean the same thing, that different hands could work together to build something strong. And Nathaniel was at the center of it all. He was a sturdy, happy toddler with his father's serious eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. He toddled between the two worlds, equally at home listening to an Apache story or chasing after a settler's dog, a living bridge between two peoples. He was no longer a key to a treasure or a sacrificial lamb. He was just a boy, beloved and safe. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery colors, Ellen led Rachel to the fire circle behind their home. The entire community was gathered. Paper lanterns swayed in the gentle breeze, and the air smelled of sage and roasting corn. Elan knelt before her. He didn't have a ring forged of silver or gold. Instead, he held out a simple leather cord onto which two feathers had been tied. One was from a red-tailed hawk, a symbol of protection. The other was from a dove, a symbol of peace. "My heart is your home, Rachel Garrett," he said, his voice quiet but heard by everyone. "Will you be my wife?" Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she knelt in front of him. "I am already home," she whispered. Reverend Clay, the traveling preacher who had first brought the marshal, stepped forward. He didn't speak of God or Scripture. He spoke of courage, kindness, and the family we choose. Under the endless Texas sky, witnessed by a gathering of people who had once been enemies, Elin and Rachel tied the leather cord around their joined wrists. They were no longer a warrior and a widow. They were a husband and a wife, a family. Later that night, long after the guests had gone home, and Nathaniel was asleep in the sturdy crib Elon had built, they stood together on their porch, looking out at the peaceful valley. The moon was high and bright, illuminating a world that had been reborn from the ashes of hatred and fear. Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, carved cedar horse he had given her so long ago. He pressed it into her hand. "So he will remember his courage," he said softly, repeating the words he had carved. Rachel closed her fingers around it. She looked at this man, her husband, and at the peaceful home they had built, and she knew they had done more than just survive. They had created a new story in a land of old ghosts, a story of hope, a story that proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply choose love in a world determined to make you hate. And they knew in the quiet way that you know the sun will rise that their story was just beginning. If this story reminded you that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the people you'd bleed for, then you've found your tribe. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We share new stories every week about the moments that define us, the choices that save us, and the unexpected love that can build a home in the heart of the wilderness. Let us know in the comments. What was the one act of courage that stood out to you the most? We read every single one. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next trail.